Y'all have any questions? So, have you looked at the study guide yet?
On chapter 5.
Okay.
You said research on the relationship between the SAT and the college dropout.
Yeah, that's right. SAT, impulsivity, and college dropouts. So, does anybody remember the relationship between all those things?
It's
Go ahead.
Your lower self-control means the more likely you are to drop out or not do well.
Yeah, so, and that was only among students with what type of?
High scores.
Yeah, so among students with high SAT scores, those with high impulsivity, which is pretty much the same thing as low self-control, were more likely to drop out of college. Yeah. So if you've got high SAT scores, but you're impulsive, that's going to mean that you're more likely to drop out. Yeah. So and they only found that relationship between impulsivity and dropout rates among students with high SAT scores. They didn't find it among students with lower SAT scores. Any other questions?
yes.
Okay, yeah. I'm glad you brought some. Lay them on me.
Chapter 10. Know the basics of the object relations theory.
Yes, the object relations theory. This was in your textbook and not covered in class. So, can anybody give us a brief summary of object relations theory? What's that?
I read it in the book, but I just...
Okay. So it's still a little confusing after reading it?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so this is, I'll try to make it clear here. So this theory suggests that as we go through life, we form internal mental representations of the other people that we see. And so we form expectations for other people's behavior based on those internalized representations. So, in other words, you might form like a little internal version of your parents, your mother and father. And so those are really the objects of object relations theory, is those internalized representations. And then so whenever you see another mother and father, you predict how they're going to act and what they're going to do based on your previous experiences, based on those internal representations from the object relations theory. And that's like the most basic rundown of it.
Yeah. That's pretty much dealing with just people and not...
yeah, I think it's mainly applied to that. I don't know if anybody has tried to apply it to other types of things. Like, I mean, there are what do you call them? My brain is fried after a long day of lecturing. Cognitive psychologists who study conceptualization and like how people form mental prototypes. So these work in kind of the same way, but I think it's usually applied to social relationships. This theory.
Is that the one that had the monkey? Was that the subject when they had the robot and then the one?
Oh, Harlow's? No, I don't think that was. I don't think that was object relations theory. That was attachment theory, I believe. Yeah. So, other questions? Yeah.
I have one for chapter 11. The second one is the way Martin means to say that people have a desire for positive.
Okay. So, anybody want to help us out here? What is a desire for positive regard?
People want to be seen in a positive manner, like they want to come off as good people or to be admired.
Yeah, so people want to be admired, they want to be loved. Of course, Rogers is one of those humanistic psychologists, so he gets a little more touchy-feely than a lot of modern psychologists would, but so you can think of positive regard as being it's the same thing as being loved by others. But he said that there were different types of positive regard. Does anybody remember the different types of those?
Is it, the unconditional love and the other one?
Yeah, it's conditional versus unconditional positive regard. And so Rogers said that in order to really be happy, people need to have unconditional positive regard, which is just kind of a more fancy way of saying you need to be unconditionally loved by some other person. Yeah. So,
That
you have
same chapter,
11?
the very first question, yeah.
Fully functioning person?
Yeah, fully functioning person.
Okay, so what is a fully functioning person according to Maslow? Anybody? Oh, you're close. So it isn't necessarily a person who is self-actualized, because according to these folks, there aren't that many people who have actually reached self-actualization.
It's a person who's in the process of achieving self-actualization.
Exactly. They're successfully working toward achieving self-actualization. So they may not have gotten there yet. They may not have reached their full potential, but they're on the right track. Yeah.
With that being said, self-actualization, do we determine what that is, or do the people around us determine what self-actualization is?
That's an excellent question. And self-actualization is actually one of the more controversial topics that came out of the humanistic theory, because of the fact that a lot of people have questioned the vague definition that was provided of it. So, I mean, I say self-actualization is achieving your full potential, but what is that exactly? It's going to vary depending on the person, depending on the culture. So there's not a clear answer of exactly what that is, but it's an excellent question. Any other questions? You guys are doing great so far.
The first one on chapter 10.
Okay, first one in chapter 10. Oops. That's this one here. Know the main differences between the neo-analytic view and the classic Freudian view. All right. So, what are those? Anybody know? What are some of the differences? So I think we went over these at the beginning of chapter 10. So, one was that the neo-analytic folks still think childhood is important for development, but they think that we continue to develop on through adolescence and into young adulthood. So Freud, if you recall, believed that personality development was pretty much complete by the time you reached that latency stage at 5 or 6, and that all the really important stuff happened when you were a really little kid or an infant. But again, the neo-analytic folks believe that development happens over a longer period. Now, they still would agree that childhood is important, but they think that later times are important too. So let's see. Let me check my notes here real quick. I know that's one of the big differences. Yeah, the 5 ideas behind modern psychoanalysis. So we talked about some of the things that were consistent between Freud and the neo-analytic folks there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the only other big difference that I would point out is that, let's see, if you recall, Freud believes that you can actually change personality by going through psychoanalysis, but a lot of other theorists don't believe that that's the case, and they think that personality is pretty much set, and it can't be changed very much. And most of the neo-analysts are going to probably agree with this for the most part. Let me look at your exam real quick and make sure you know everything you need to know for this one. I don't want to leave you hanging. All right. Okay. So, yeah, another thing you'll want to know about is that, let's see, so Freud thought that one of the most important components of personality was the id. So a lot of his theories were really id-centered, whereas more modern psychoanalytic folks tend to put a lot more emphasis on the ego. So we had that whole chapter on the self, if you recall, and the self is really all about the ego. And so make sure that you know that modern people tend to focus more on the ego, whereas Freud focused more on the id.
Was the id, the Thanatos and all that?
So that's slightly different. I think that the id would contain both the eros and thanatos. So thanatos is the death instinct, and the eros is the life instinct, and those are really channeled in different ways by the id and the superego. But yeah, so they really underlie those other processes.
I'm just looking up at the board right now with the field dependence and the field independence.
Yeah.
I understand how the rod and frame test correlates to that, but what is the importance of dependence versus independence in the field of personality? What are we measuring? I mean, besides dependence and independence?
You're measuring, it's something related to perception, and it's whether people perceive an entire field or whether they're more detail-oriented. And so does anybody remember the distinction between people who are field-dependent and field-independent? Who is more sociable?
Field dependent.
The independent? They related it with cops in the book, and how one of them will notice the really, really little things, but not actually realize like the whole picture.
Yeah,
and
so it
the
was,
independents noticed everything. It wasn't just one little detail.
so the finding was that the field-independent police officers were better able actually to pay attention to the little details. So independent meant detail-oriented, and it was the it was the field-dependent people that were more sociable. Yeah. So make sure you know that. And then of course the field. We also mentioned that the people who are field-dependent prefer careers that involve more social interaction, like the social sciences, education, whereas field-independent people were more likely to prefer the natural sciences, things where they could work in a more solitary type of environment, laboratory tasks and things like that. Okay. And you all, any questions about those specific tests, the rod and frame or embedded figures? Remember the embedded figures was the one with hidden pictures.
Can you go over personal project analysis, please?
Yeah, personal projects analysis. That's another one from chapter 12 there. So, does anybody remember what personal projects analysis involves? Yeah.
You list the goals and rank importance, difficulty, enjoyment, progress, maybe positive section goals.
Exactly. Yeah, it has to do with how people perceive their goals, and so some people, depending on their personality, will perceive their goals a little bit more positively, and other people will view them as being difficult to accomplish. I think one thing that I had you do there was read a short section in your textbook about the relationship between the Big Five and personal projects analysis. So there was a certain personality trait that we talked about for a lot of the semester, and people who are high in that trait are more likely to perceive their goals as being difficult to achieve. Anybody know what that is? It wasn't pessimism. What were you saying? Yeah, people who are well, not narcissistic. Sorry, neurotic. Yeah. I was thrown off because it started with an N. Glad this isn't multiple choice review day. Yeah, so people high in neuroticism are more likely to view their personal projects and goals as being frustrating and hard to reach.